Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our event and welcome to the launch of the Happy Planet Index 2021. My name is Rabia and I'll be your host for this event. So I am the narratives lead at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, or WEAll, which is the leading global collaboration of individuals, organizations, and movements who are working towards a well-being economy, an economy where decision makers prioritize the long-term well-being of people and planet. So this year, WEAll has partnered with the creators of the Happy Planet Index because we believe that it's a really important and helpful tool to help us reframe progress and priorities for the economy. So today, you will hear from Nick Marks and Sama Abdallah, who are the creators of the Happy Planet Index. So Nick will walk us through some of the background of the Happy Planet Index, and then Sama will walk us through the latest data, telling us how the world is doing in terms of sustainable well-being. Then we'll move into a panel discussion with 4 excellent economic thinkers and decision makers, and then we'll move into a short Q&A session with your questions. So by the end of the event, I'm hoping that we leave with a stronger understanding of the findings from the Happy Planet Index, that we've had a chance to discuss the implications for decision-making at all levels around the world, and also, and very excitingly, how to engage with the Happy Planet Index and with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance after this event. So with that, I want to thank you guys again for joining. I think we had like around over 200 people signed up. Super exciting, and we're excited to get everyone up to date. So with that, I'll pass it on to Nick to get us started.
Thank you, Rabia. Am I on the spotlight now? Sorry, I don't know quite how this works. So Surma, if you could put the next slide on. So this is the launch of the Happy Planet, and I came up with the idea of the Happy Planet Index in 2005 on a slightly whimsical walk with my dog, where I started thinking about, well, if good lives are the aim of the economy, then really the sustainable development question is like, how efficient are we at creating those good lives? And my first attempt at creating an index sort of happened quickly, and I called it the Sustainable Wellbeing Index. It would not have been so successful if someone else hadn't come up with the idea to call it the Happy Planet Index, because it sort of kind of ties it together. Next slide, Surma, please. So the question becomes like, how do good lives should not cost the earth? How do we measure whether good lives cost the earth? And the aim really is that there's a tension with sustainability around good lives now and good lives in the future. And can we create an index that holds that tension? Next slide, please. And the way that we worked out to do it was to say, well, if the country's well-being is really the quality of people's lives, which we can measure with subjective well-being, with happiness, and the length of their lives, life expectancy. So just like we have health-adjusted life years, these are happy adjusted life years. So a happy life years is what Ruud Veenhoven, the Dutch psychologist, called it. But what we did differently was we said, well, actually, the ecological footprint is how much pressure you put on the planet. So the well-being, life expectancy is sort of the ultimate outcome, and the fundamental input is the ecological footprint. So we divided the two. It's not strictly a division. Surma does some great statistical wizardry so that we balance up the variances between the two. But basically, we're looking for high well-being, high life expectancy, low ecological footprint. And that becomes the indicator of the Happy Planet Index. So it's great delight that we're launching this version of it in 2021. We've got data from 2019 and some from 2020, but not a full one for the world in 2020. And we're delighted to do it with WEAll, who are such a great organization for promoting the core idea, which is to create a well-being economy that works for everybody. So I'm going to pass you over to Surma now, and then the panel, but Surma's going to show the results from this year's. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. So the first thing I'll do is, as Nick said, the data we're looking at here is mostly from 2019, but we also have some data from 15 years of trend data, so back to 2006. And I will give you a little sneak preview of the data in 2020, although there are some cautions to be said there. So I'll go straight to the website, show the data, which the website was launched today. So we're very excited to be able to show you that. I hope everyone can see the screen. So I'll start with life expectancy. I always find it helpful when looking at the Happy Planet Index to break it down by the components and build it up together. So the pattern for life expectancy perhaps is the most, that's perhaps the most familiar component of the Happy Planet Index, is what many people would be familiar with wealthy countries, Western Europe, North America, East Asia, having the highest life expectancies, Hong Kong 84.9 years, Japan 84.6 years, etc. But there are some surprises, or I guess maybe not surprises for everyone, but certainly at first sight surprises. So there are a couple of countries in Latin America which have higher life expectancy than over 80 years. So that's Chile and Costa Rica. Lebanon, a country which has been in the news for many reasons over recent years, has a life expectancy of 79 years, which is actually higher than the USA. And there are other countries which have life expectancy over 75, which are considerably poorer. So in terms of GDP, which I guess is our standard measure of success. So then just a few examples: Ecuador, Algeria, Vietnam as well. We had these. We've got this sort of color coding with the three components, where green is good, yellow is medium, red is bad. The thresholds here are so for green is 75 years, for yellow is 65 years. So now on to well-being, and the pattern is a little bit different. And here you can see that some of the countries in East Asia, which had very high life expectancy, don't have such high experienced well-being. The highest countries here at the top of the table here is dominated by basically Scandinavia and Finland, 7.8 out of 10. And again, there are some countries which are perhaps, which sort of break the sort of, where you see that subjective well-being doesn't correlate exactly with GDP. So Costa Rica, for example, and Vanuatu, which you can barely see on the map, but is down here in the Pacific, both have scores of 7 out of 10, which is higher than the USA, despite being having considerably lower GDP per capita. The lowest score for experienced well-being is Afghanistan, 2.4 out of 10. This is 2019, I note, so it's before all that's been happening over the recent months. And also worth noting is India, which has the 4th lowest subjective well-being score in the world in 2019. So what happens when you then put on the environmental side of things? As Nick said, there's a tension between the outcomes, which I've just mentioned, and the environmental impact. And as you can see, and maybe isn't so surprising, the map flips round. So the countries that were green are mostly red now, and the countries that were red are mostly green. And so now the best performance in terms of ecological footprint is in Africa and South Asia. Now, there are a couple of, and I guess the Happy Planet Index gets interesting when you see the countries which manage to achieve relatively good ecological footprint and also relatively good outcomes. And you can see that, for example, if you flip, I mean, this will work better when you play with the website at home, but if you flick between life expectancy and ecological footprint, there are 3 countries which stay green on both those measures, and they are Ecuador down here, Armenia, and Sri Lanka. So this just kind of gives a hint of sort of some of the countries which are able to achieve a high level of life expectancy whilst having sustainable well-being, sustainable footprints. And you can do a similar thing with the subjective well-being measure as well. So let's put it all together then. Sorry, I just want to also mention that, going back to ecological footprint, most countries, only 27% of countries are green here. Green here is countries which have a per capita footprint which is lower than the global biocapacity, per capita biocapacity. So only a handful of countries are green here, and most countries are red and yellow. So let's see what happens when we combine it all together to the Happy Planet Index. And this map is perhaps, if you've seen the Happy Planet Index before, it's perhaps quite familiar. If you are used to looking at more traditional measures of development and progress, then it's perhaps quite surprising. So South America and Latin America in general is coming up green, is doing quite well. North America, for example, is not doing so well. In this year's edition of the Happy Planet Index, we're seeing a lot of European countries actually coming up green as well, and I'll show you the table later, which highlights some of the surprising results there. That wasn't the case in earlier years, and that's partly to do with a change in the methodology and the ecological footprint, but also some genuine changes in terms of ecological footprint in Western European countries. So I'm going to now take you to the table. When we first did Happy Planet Index, we were very loath to do a ranking, but obviously doing a ranking gets a lot of interest. So I'll go to that ranking now. And Costa Rica is again the top country. So the fourth time in a row, Costa Rica has the highest Happy Planet Index of 62.1. And this year it's followed by Vanuatu, Colombia, Switzerland, and Ecuador. Of those, Switzerland perhaps is the surprise that wasn't in the top 5 previously. And as I say, this is partly due to a change in the ecological footprint methodology, but also due to a rapidly decreasing ecological footprint in Switzerland. And it's not unique in that sense. If you look at, I can add in other countries, and you'll see other Western European countries and other sort of, I guess, industrialized countries doing better than in previous Happy Planet Index. So New Zealand is in 11th place, the UK, where many of my colleagues are based, is in 14th place, Netherlands 18th, etc., etc. Having said that, though, the USA still comes relatively low, 122nd place. The ecological footprint has also declined in the USA, but it's still much higher. 8.2 global hectares is about 4 planets worth of resources, maybe even 5 planets worth of resources. So that's why the USA still doesn't do as well as some of the Western European countries. So that's for 2019. I'm going to quickly now give you a little bit of a preview of, well, I'm going to first of all talk about the trends and then give you a little preview about the results in 2020. Looking at using data across 15 years, we're able to show patterns for a few selected countries and see some changes. So as I've mentioned before, the UK has seen an increase in, sorry, I haven't mentioned that before, but the UK has seen an increase in its Happy Planet Index. That's the green line here, which started at about 45 in 2007 and is now up to 56. Similar trend for the EU, that's the pink line there. Meanwhile, another interesting trend to note is India, whose HPI score has fallen from 50 in 2006 right down to 36.4. It's now one of the lowest HPI scores in the world. If we look at regions as a whole, or sort of continents, another interesting pattern to note, another interesting trend to note, I guess, is Africa, which still has, so Africa on average still has some of the lowest HPI scores, but there's a generally positive trend there. There's an increase in the HPI for Africa, and for different reasons compared to the reasons for Western Europe and the UK. So for Western Europe and UK, we're seeing ecological footprint falling and subjective well-being sort of rising slightly in some cases. In Africa, we're seeing life expectancy rapidly rising, subjective well-being sometimes rising, and ecological footprint not rising in most countries in Africa. So these are kind of showing 2 different ways that HPI can increase for different parts of the world. So overall, a generally positive trend up until 2019. Sorry, let's just say 2019 there. The question is what happened in 2020. Now, as I say, this is tentative data. We only have subjective well-being for 90 out of 150 countries for 2020. And the ecological footprint data is all estimated, and life expectancy data is estimated for most countries as well. Nevertheless, I think there are some interesting lessons here, which are probably counterintuitive, but can be explained when you think about the data in detail. So this is looking across region by region. And you can see that for most regions, the Happy Planet Index has actually risen in 2020. So the 2020 data is just obviously the last point there. It has risen for Western Europe, it's risen for East Asia. I guess the main region where you see a fall in the Happy Planet Index is Latin America, which is not surprising, perhaps, given the way the pandemic has hit in Latin America, particularly in Brazil, actually. That's mostly driven by Brazil. You can look at details with country by country, which I won't do now, of course, given the time. But I want to sort of just reflect a little bit on why that's the case before we move on. Generally, we can see there are 2 basic reasons for why the HPI seems to have risen. Firstly, as we've heard in the media, carbon dioxide emissions have fallen in 2020. It's the biggest fall, I think, since since 2008. And that's reflecting the ecological footprint. The ecological footprint across the globe has fallen by 6.5%. In richer countries, it's fallen by 15%. Meanwhile, well-being did not fall everywhere. It fell in some countries, but there are countries where it has risen. And we can see that in the data we use, which is a Gallup World Poll, but we've also seen that in other data sources such as Eurobarometer, and even some national statistics agencies have reported well-being rising. And of course, this is not to celebrate the pandemic. This is not to suggest that obviously the pandemic is a good thing. But when we think about those three components that we measure here, it sort of makes sense, because obviously for most people, the impact of the pandemic was not, for most people, the impact for the pandemic was not serious illness or death, although of course that happened for many, but actually the impacts were to do with the radical change in lifestyles. People have had quite major changes in their lifestyle, slowing down, reduced consumption, and in many cases spending more time with family and close relationships. And those kind of changes, when you think about it, kind of make sense that those changes have led to a fall in ecological footprint without a fall in well-being, and in some cases even a rise in well-being. Obviously, there's lots to learn in terms of what we can do in the future, and I just think it's important to recognize that as a possible positive note going forward, because it shows that we can reduce our emissions, we can reduce our footprint whilst maintaining a good quality of life. So those are, well, just to wrap up with the key takeaways. Do I have time for this, Rabia? Yeah, okay. So first thing to say is good lives don't need to cost the earth. We can see that there are countries which achieve a high level of well-being and a high level of life expectancy with a much lower ecological footprint than some of the wealthier countries in the world. And Costa Rica time and time again demonstrates that. Secondly, we are becoming more efficient at delivering longer, happier lives with fewer environmental resources. We are still not quite there. There's still no country that achieves a good score on all three measures, and that's important to note. But we seem to be getting a little bit closer. The issue is we're not getting there fast enough, of course. And just as we've seen that CO2 emissions overall have fallen, but not fallen fast enough in many wealthy countries, we are seeing the HPI is rising, but not fast enough. And then lastly, just that note on the pandemic. Of course, we need to learn a lot in terms of the horrific ways that it's changed our lives, but we can also try and identify some of the positive lessons we can learn from it in terms of achieving perhaps a slower pace of life and lower consumption, but still achieving good well-being. So thank you very much for listening. And now I will pass back to Rabia, who will introduce the wonderful panelists.
Awesome. Thank you, Sama. I love that we ended on a positive note. I think one of the things I like about the Happy Planet Index is that, while there's a lot of, negative stuff that we talk about in terms of climate change, there are a lot of positive stories, and we can make change if we want to. So thank you for that, Sama. So with all of that data fresh in our minds, let's move on to the panel discussion. So today we're really fortunate to have with us four amazing panelists who I'm hoping will help us understand from a research and practice perspective, sort of how do we contextualize the findings that Sama just walked us through. So on our panel, we have Liz Zeidler, who's the Chief Executive Officer and founder of the Center for Thriving Places. We've got Lorenzo Fioramonti, who among his many hats also wears the hat of leader of the Green Party in the Italian Parliament. We've got Sophie Howe, who's the Future Generations Commissioner in the Welsh Government. And finally, we have Tim Kasser, who's a psychologist, emeritus professor, and author in the areas of materialism, consumer capitalism, and values, among many other things. So before we jump into our panel discussion, I did want to let you all know that we'll be collecting questions in the chat for our Q&A session just after the panel discussion. So please do submit your questions for our panelists. And if you do have a specific panelist you'd like to answer a specific question, please do name them so we can make sure we get those questions answered for you. Of course, we have 10 minutes for the panel discussion, so we won't be able to get to everything, but of course, after the event, we'll try to make sure all of our communications help to clarify anything you'd like to know more about. So with that, basically, I want to jump into our first question. So I think Nick talked about earlier that how we wanted the Happy Planet Index to act as a compass to help point us towards a new vision for the economy, where progress and priorities are just seen differently. So in terms of, I guess, keeping that in mind, my first question is, how is the Happy Planet Index helpful for creating a new vision for an economy and for helping us work towards it? So I know that Tim has to leave a little bit early, and he won't be able to join the Q&A session after the panel discussion. So I'll put this first one to you, Tim. What are your thoughts?
Well, I love this metaphor of a compass because it fits a lot with the work that I've done on values. And most researchers in psychology and other fields think of values as being guiding principles. So they're principles that guide us as we go about in the world trying to make decisions. And values can be exemplified in people's behavior, in organizations' behavior, in nations' behavior. And I think one of the things that's obvious is that the standard measures of progress value financial success, value economic growth, value making as much money as possible and as much profit as possible. So that's the compass of the GNP and the GDP and of the Dow Jones. That's the set of values which drive those particular measures and which are reinforced when those measures go up. In contrast, the Happy Planet Index and other kinds of alternative indexes like the HPI tend to privilege a different set of values, right? They're values that my colleagues and I call intrinsic values. So values for personal growth and physical health, which are represented pretty well in the numerator of the HPI, and then values for community and helping the broader world, which I think are well represented in the denominator, so in the ecological outcomes of the HPI. And so I think that the real promise of the HPI and other sorts of measures like it is to reorient people, citizens and politicians and organizations towards indicators which prioritize a different set of values than those which have been traditionally prioritized by purely economic indicators.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. That was really, really helpful. So if we're looking at new values for how we measure success, and tools like the Happy Planet Index help to clarify what those could be, how do we make this vision or these values sort of mainstream? How do we make them a reality in our economic decision making? How do we make this shift? So I'll pass this one back to you, Tim, to get us started.
I think one of the main things to me that has to happen is that indicators like the HPI have to be taken as seriously as our current indicators are taken, right? So if you could imagine for a second a world in which you hear on the news and you hear from governmental leaders at all levels of government, you know, whether it's the city or this province or state or the federal level or the national level, and you hear from your friends just as much information about, oh, how's well-being doing in the nation right now, or how many bird species have gone extinct in the last 6 months, et cetera. If you heard about those just as much as we heard about the Dow Jones, and we hear about other stock market indicators, and we hear about GNP or GDP, then what would start to be happening is that there'd be another set of values being propounded out there that people would think, hey, these values are important. And theoretically, what would happen, at least in democracies, would be that individuals would begin to put pressure on their politicians to maximize that other set of values, just like right now they put pressure on their politicians to maximize economic outcomes, right? So how many politicians have risen or fallen on the basis of the economy of wherever they're in charge of? Because people know that the economy is no good. Well, if people started to know that the HPI or whatever the parallel is for your city, state, or province or nation, is going up or down, then they could begin to put pressure on politicians to start to make the institutional policy decisions that would theoretically continue to increase the HPI or other kinds of things. And so, some of this is happening at city and state and provincial levels, but obviously we need to ramp it up big time if we're gonna really have success at this. So that's my take on what kind of needs to happen with an indicator like this.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Sophie, I want to pass this one on to you. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience in Wales? Because I know your role is, I guess, a direct result of changing values.
Yes, absolutely. So Wales is the only country in the world to have legislated to protect the interests of future generations through our Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. But it actually does a number of things, bringing three sort of concepts together. So first of all, we set out 7 national wellbeing goals, which are linked back to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So putting those on a statutory footing, critically important. It embeds this concept around, how do we test our decisions? And whether they balance the needs of current generations and future generations. And then it's sort of, it's called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And the definition of well-being, or the requirements of our legislation on all of our public institutions, is to improve the social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales. And so that then really permeates through all of our policy making. So the Act applies to our government, and to 43 other public institutions delivering services and policy to the public at all levels. And I think, we've seen a number of shifts in terms of public policy resulting from our legislation. From something which I think is really interesting, our new Beyond Recycling strategy, which sets an ambition for Wales to be zero waste by 2050. At the moment, we're 3rd in the world for our recycling rates, but actually we're saying we need to go beyond that and actually be sort of refusing and reusing and reducing and so on, not just recycling. But what's really interesting in terms of the approach that this legislation is driving is that in developing that strategy, our government has actually made the connections between zero waste and community well-being and tackling loneliness and isolation. Now, you might say, what has zero waste got to do with loneliness and isolation? Well, it's actually all about how you decide to go about doing that. So, zero waste for us is doing things like establishing community libraries, libraries of things. There's a Welsh word which is benthyg or borrow. And so part of our strategy is library of things, where instead of everyone in your street having a lawnmower stuck in their garage taking up room, actually what we're going to do to reduce waste and reduce consumption is have a library where you can borrow a lawnmower or a paint stripper or a hedge trimmer or any of those things that you might need. We're also going to establish repair cafes. So you can go along, and this is where you make the link between community cohesion, loneliness and isolation, and reducing waste, because you bring those two things together. People interacting in their communities, reducing waste, but also connecting, conversing, building relationships and so on. And the fact that our civil servants have actually made those connections, and they've looked at, this holistic approach to across our 7 national wellbeing goals, which cover improved health and wellbeing, cover ecological resilience, cover the circular economy, cover inequality and community cohesion and so on. How can we develop our policies in a way which speak to and act on as many of those 7 wellbeing goals as possible? That's the sort of difference that I think legislating can make. And I just want to say a brief word about the government's economic strategy. So I suppose one of my favourite things when I tweeted about the government's economic strategy, and sorry about my son wandering around there in the background. But one of the things that I was really proud of, I tweeted about this economic strategy, and someone tweeted back from Scotland, I think, saying, can everyone just take a moment and pause and look at this economic strategy, which does not mention GDP? What I want to tell you that the economic strategy does say is right up front, it says improving the well-being of everyone in Wales is the government's economic mission. Recognising the potential for the economy to do harm as well as to do good. And it talks about a holistic approach to the economy, focusing on delivering people's well-being. Now, there are still some challenges in terms of how do you take those words and change the habits of very many lifetimes, very many decision makers who might not be, acting on those words. But I think we're off to a pretty good start. And I think the key thing for the Happy Planet Index is how do we go beyond it being a metrics to compare and to see where we are and how we're doing, to it actually being a framework which is used to determine what policies governments and others take forward.
Awesome. That's really inspiring. Thank you so much, Sophie. I don't think that most countries in the world aren't as far along as Wales is. So thank you for your part in helping us move forward. So I guess with that, I wanted to ask Liz, I know in your experience at the national, regional, and local level, why do you think it is that decision makers are not sort of where Wales is right now? Why are we not making this shift towards prioritizing new values?
Great question. I always want to cheer whenever Sophie speaks, so I need to sort of, center myself. I think one of the reasons, we have to be really honest, there's been some really interesting stuff in the chat actually, as we've been talking, that the status quo is much easier, and we live in a world that has a huge amount invested in the current economic model working. So anyone trying to push against that is trying to push against a very big machine. So I think it's important in a conversation like this to front that one up. And I think in terms of that shift that we're all talking about today, we're really reliant at the moment on some really courageous pioneers, some brilliant leaders, people like Sophie, others around the world who are prepared to put their head above the parapet and put this stuff front and center. And frankly, realistically, there aren't enough of them. There aren't enough of those incredibly courageous pioneers. Interestingly, I'm only going to mention this one, but a lot of them around the world are women. So I'm going to let that one wash over. But anyway, but we can't wait for those few national leaders that we have, the kind of Jacinda Ardern's in the world, those sorts of people we hear about in the headlines. We can't wait for every country to have those. Realistically, here in the UK, we're going to be waiting a very long time at a national level. We need this to happen really fast, and we need to happen at scale, which is why Centre for Thriving Places really focuses on this kind of local place-based change. I would love to be saying, yes, let's just get every nation in the world signed up to this kind of way of working, this kind of mindset. But if that's not going to happen tomorrow, we really need it to start happening tomorrow with the urgency of the climate crisis and the spiraling inequalities our current economic model are giving us. We have to start supporting place-based change. So it is the cities, it's the regions, it's the local areas that can start creating that momentum. And how can we make it easier for those local areas that perhaps don't have that amazing legislation that Sophie's just talked about, or the incredible kind of budgetary awareness that some of the pioneering nations are providing? How can we make it easier? I use the word easier a lot. I know it's not easy, but let's make it easier to start working against that status quo. So a lot of our work is trying to take, one of the questions in the stream again earlier was, how do we make this practical and actionable? I like the word actionable at a local level. So we provide tools across the UK for all the local authorities in England and Wales. That's, I think, 373 or something like that this year. To really make that possible. So we take that kind of level, a picture of the Happy Planet Index, and give it the detail and the practicality, and provide the data out there for free to the places to make it easier to take those steps. So I think what's in the way is a vast ocean of the current system trying to stop us move there. What is a big barrier is the sense that it's not possible now. So people fall back into that status quo. So we need to make it actionable. We need to make it easier, and we need to remember that even without endless financial resources or legislation or anything else that some countries are providing for this, even without that, a lot of this is a mindset, as Sophie so eloquently described. A lot of it is about how you're making those decisions, what you're prioritizing, what compass you're using, as Nick and Tim both described earlier. And people can, local places can start doing that tomorrow. They can start saying, in our local area, whether that's a tiny town, big city, or a region, in our area, we're going to make our decisions based on this compass, not a compass that has got us into this unbelievable mess in the first place.
Wow, that's actually, yeah, that's really insightful. I wanted to pass it to Lorenzo just to speak to that. So Liz mentioned actors at different levels. So from your experience, probably at the national level, what actors need to be involved and how can they start to use a compass like the HPI or similar tools to help us shift priorities and affect change?
Well, I think there are at least two sectors that are fundamental in this process, and one is the media. The media, often for the wrong reasons, but they are crucial. And many journalists don't really understand these things. They simply, someone said earlier, I don't remember who that was, Liz, I think, you said, the status quo is convenient, right? Journalists are very lazy people, right? So they simply regurgitate the old notions. And when you challenge them to say something different, it's more work for them, right? So we need to somehow spoon feed journalists. I think we have to be much more aggressive at tackling the media. And then the other one is the entrepreneurs. I think we have to identify, we have to create demand for these indicators. I think indicators are fundamental, but we need to be able, it's not enough. Sama and the others know this very well. They've done it for so many years. I think I remember Brain Pool, like a project you guys ran a few years ago in which you were trying to understand what makes an indicator work for a policymaker, for instance, or for a business person. You need to be an active scientist. You need to go out there and create the demand for your product. So it's not enough to just publish a paper and say people will use it. So no one uses the Happy Planet Index unless we start creating demand for that. So we need to understand, in the story that we tell, we need to make sure that an entrepreneur out there will realize that this is useful to showcase what he or she does, right? So there's an additional work that has to be done. And I'd like to emphasize this as a former policymaker. You do get policymaker. I was a minister for 2 years and a national minister with these ideas, right? But it's not enough to have someone out there that like this heroic, person tries to push this agenda if it's isolated. So around that story, you need to build many different stories that somehow amplify the impact. So once you have that kind of leadership, you need to find the entrepreneurs that are willing to join, and then you have to find the journalists that are willing to join this. Otherwise, what happens? I'll give you an example. The Guardian was a very liberal and progressive newspaper. It's going to write a beautiful article about Sama and Nick and their Happy Planet Index until one of them becomes a minister of industrial policy. And that's when the media will turn against it. So the same person that was celebrated as a good scientist will become, this is a personal history, right? It will become an idiot, a useless politician, someone who doesn't know, who doesn't know what he's doing, someone who doesn't understand the economy and so on and so forth. And the same media will start destroying everything unless you have educated the media. So we need to do this it's very important that we understand the importance of creating demand, and that has to be cultivated. And not everyone understands the value of this immediately, I think, and it's our job to be able to do so. And I think the two critical sectors that are usually not addressed are business and the media.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that is really helpful. All of the research I've done is also the media needs to be talking about it to make it like a people's issue versus just something like politics on the side. So speaking about creating demand for something like this, what other tools or stories does the Happy Planet Index or similar tools need to work with to gain traction to create that demand among people at all levels, including entrepreneurs, national decision makers, regular folks? What are your thoughts, Lorenzo?
Is it me again? Okay.
Yes,
I think it needs to, this sort of story, because the indicator is a story, right? And let's never forget, and I'm saying this to Liz, was reasonably really busy trying to enact change from the bottom up. But it's very hard to do so when the national performance indicator is a totally different one, right? So, well, a lot of people will tell you, use this, come up, think of a country as a company. You talk to the workers and you say to them, look, you need to do this differently. You need to change your habits. You need to change your way of working. And they will be very happy to do so. But then we'll tell you, look, but if my KPIs say exactly the opposite, my salary is attached to a totally different performance mechanism. How can I change that? At the end of the day, they will become complacent and they will say what the KPI are saying. They expect them to do. So we cannot fight against a national KPI, which is exactly the opposite of what we predicate at the local level. So it's very important to do this. So that's why I think the HPI has to work with all the subjective well-being indicators, the gen progress indicators, the alternative GDP movement, everything that is moving in that direction. They may not be the same thing, but they're telling a very similar story. We shouldn't be picky. We shouldn't cannibalize each other. It shouldn't be, often this is what scientists do, right? I like my indicator more than yours, and I try to campaign for my indicator against yours. That's a mistake. I think all of them go in the same direction. And another thing that I think is crucial in this process, it is to showcase all these indicators as a way of doing economics better. We shouldn't fight against the idea of, we shouldn't simply say this is about intrinsic values, although that is very important, but it's also about extrinsic values. It's about living better. It's about doing better, and doing better is quite trendy vis-a-vis doing more, right? I mean, GDP economic system is doing more, and that's quite appealing. If you think about it, we shouldn't disregard the appeal of doing more. You can only compete with doing more, I think, if you come up with a doing better strategy. Doing better is pretty cool. I think I would buy doing better vis-a-vis doing more. The fact, for instance, that Larry Page moved to New Zealand, I think it's something we need to use. Like a rich man goes, travels from the US to live in New Zealand, because in New Zealand you live better. You don't live, you don't do more, you do better. And I think this doing better puts us in gives us a competitive edge vis-a-vis the arch enemy, which is doing more. And I think, don't take it them as a critique, but I think that referring only to the intrinsic values, to the facts that we value something different, which is true, is not going to give us that competitive advantage. We need to have a better story to sell. And I think doing better is a pretty good story that is captivating and extremely competitive vis-a-vis the conventional doing more, which is the growth accumulation mechanism that we're fighting against.
Right. Okay, so I know, thank you for that, Lorenzo. I know that Tim will have to leave in just a couple of minutes. So I wanted to pass on to Tim. I know you talk about intrinsic and extrinsic values. Is there a last, parting note you wanted to talk about?
Well, I thank Lorenzo for raising the issue. I'm not sure that I agree with how he characterized what we've defined extrinsic values as being. But I guess what I would say is there's no doubt that a healthy economy is part of doing better and doing well, especially in those nations that we saw were red on life expectancy. So there are some nations that do need to grow economically in certain ways, and then there are other nations where we've probably grown enough. We are a big mature oak tree in terms of our economy, not in terms of our behavior, but in terms of our economy. And, we need to be able to maintain our health for a long time in an efficient way. So, I wish we had more time to dig into that. And I apologize to everyone for the fact that I have to leave. And if there are questions that anybody has specifically for me, do feel free to email me. Rabia, I'm sure, can share my email address. And again, sorry, I've got to go, but good luck with the rest of everything, and good luck with the launch of the Happy Planet Index. I wish you the greatest success.
Thank you so much, Tim. It was great to have you. Awesome. Okay, so this is great timing because I wanted to leave 10 minutes for a Q&A session. So I think we've, Liz, Sophie, and Lorenzo have raised some really interesting points that hopefully we'll be able to answer. So the first question from the audience is that the Happy Planet Index is very dependent on its 3 constituent indices. Are there any methodological changes in the way that these indices have been calculated to affect your results? Actually, sorry, that's more of a general question. Let's stay away from that. Sorry about that. So question for all the panelists. How have you any thoughts about how a restorative climate justice component might be included in the index? And that's been asked in the context of, in the recognition of the past 3 centuries, wealthy nations have the widest gulf between rich and poor. Yeah, and then that also contributes to how we're experiencing the climate and biodiversity crises. So how about, Sophie, did you want to get us started?
Yeah, really, really good point. And it's one that I've been making really clearly. I should have said my role as Future Generations Commissioner is I'm independent of government. So my job is to hold government to account on how they deliver against our Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So, you know, Wales in particular has, you know, we were at the forefront of the last industrial revolution. So the first £1 million cheque for coal was signed in Wales over 100 years ago. So we are acutely conscious of, you know, our responsibility, I suppose, in terms of that damage that's been done to the planet. In terms of our responsibility going forward, so one of our goals, I talked about the 7 wellbeing goals in our legislation, is to be a globally responsible Wales, and that's crucially important. So some of the things, you know, what is resulting from that, well, for every child born in Wales, a tree gets planted here in Wales, and in Uganda as well. So we have currently planted trees to twice the size of Wales. We have a number of sort of exchange programs. We look at our carbon emissions in terms of the impact that that's having across the world and so on. So I think having you know, something about being a globally responsible nation is a good starting point. And I also think that actually you know, the richer nations who have been responsible for most of the damage shouldn't just be looking to stop the damage now, but they should be actually looking to put right and take their fair share historically of the damage that they've done, and therefore you know, they should be the nations who are doing more of the heavy lifting.
That makes a lot of sense. Liz, did you want to talk about anything from like a subnational perspective?
Yeah, I think this is really, really important issue, and it's one of the reasons why when we designed the Thriving Places Index, which actually took a huge amount of inspiration for the Happy Planet Index, as Nick and Sam all know, we were really keen that it's designed to say, are we creating the right local conditions for people to thrive? And are we doing that equitably so everyone can thrive? So we're not just making a few, you know, rich people happier, as current model likes to do. And are we doing it sustainably so future generations can thrive? And I think it's really important that we don't allow those two other elements to be hidden underneath data, because often if we do a generalized piece of data, you can really, really miss the fact that we're doing this either unbelievably unsustainably or deeply inequitably. So I think we need to make sure that data can be used it can be very, very powerful in the wrong way. And I think so there's the role of equality in there. And I think when we talk about kind of restorative climate justice, we're looking at past, current and future generation justice issues. So there's huge amounts of past injustices which are still hugely affecting the lives of current generations. So we need to be looking at those really embedded inequalities and how do we use this kind of legislation, this kind of data, this kind of way of thinking, this compass, to really start challenging those unbelievably embedded inequalities that come from many, many generations back, but are 100% real today, as well as looking for that future generation element of making sure that what we're doing is sustainable. And I think a lot of what we've tried to do is make sure that even at a very local level, you can embed the SDGs into whatever work you're doing. They are powerful tools, the SDGs, but they feel very, very out there for local places. You know, people think about their well-being not in terms of their nation. Most people I know don't really care that much about their national well-being statistics because they don't think of themselves in that kind of national context. They really care about what's going on for them locally. So being able to translate some of those big important things like SDGs down to a really local level, I think is really important. Back to my easy and practical thing earlier, sorry, turning it to a scratch record.
No, I mean, well, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm glad that we're reinforcing that. Lorenzo, did you have anything to add?
Very quickly, I think I'd like to reiterate what I said earlier on this issue of restorative justice. I think the indicators can have an impact on many different levels. And I think perhaps the HPI or other indicators may also really speak to those that seek justice, seek more equality at a global level, are claiming a different model in terms of environmental outcomes, social outcomes, and so on and so forth. However, I still think that the power of an indicator is defined by the ability that it has to transform the political system where it's applied, right? So if I get an indicator that Mali will use to claim something vis-a-vis France, I don't think it will go far. I need to get an indicator that can help Mali get better as Mali, right? So otherwise it's going to become one of these tools that are very common among those like us, intellectuals having lived around the world and like having predicated a different development model forever. But as a policymaker at the national level, you want to know what you can do better than your neighbor. And just like New Zealand has done so well at attracting the rich people around the world that want to move to New Zealand to live in New Zealand, I think that should be the kind of tool that you need to give to all countries and say to them, use this. You're going to create better jobs. People will live longer. You're going to eliminate crime or reduce crime. And guess what? You're going to get a lot of investment coming from overseas because the rich people will want to come and stay where you are. Why? Because you pollute less. Why? Because you live longer. Why? Because you have better well-being outcomes that you don't get anywhere else, because maybe you're sunnier, you take care of your ecosystems. That has an impact on families that want their kids to live in a different natural ecosystem. They don't want to live in downtown New York or Washington anymore. So that is something that as a national policymaker, I would want to have, because I want to compete. I want to be better than the others. And I can't do that just on a moral high ground. As important as that is, okay, so do not take me as the cynicist here, but it is important, the moral high ground and all the moral values. But as a policymaker, you want to sell something to your nation that makes them proud of being what they are. And I think that is how you make an indicator powerful. And once it gets catchy, it will become, it gets picked up by New Zealand, gets picked up by, you name it, Iceland, and so on and so forth. And I hope the countries of WEAll, including Wales, will do that. Then, WEAll is Wellbeing Economy Governments. And I think, they put together this very beautiful group of countries that I hope will become a reference point for the rest of the world. Anyway, you get competitive and the others will want to be like you. So that is the edge I'd like to see coming out of this conversation.
Right. Thank you, Lorenzo. I think that sort of relates to a question. I'm going to truncate the question. They asked, what are the possible pitfalls from including HPI in the everyday agenda or as a target for governments? So you mentioned not just taking the moral high ground, but making it more, I guess, relevant for what countries want to do and be competitive and so on. Sophie, can you maybe speak to, I guess, some of the pitfalls or not of what's happening in Wales of prioritizing something different?
I don't know if I describe them as pitfalls, because I agree with Lorenzo. What's not to love about this? And the world is kind of moving on. The point that he was just making there about we've looked at an old, the old model is, how do we attract inward investment to grow our economy by chucking a load of cash at companies and telling them that we've got the cheapest workforce, cheapest labor anywhere. Well, actually, the world is moving on, and what employers and those sorts of people who want to base their companies in different countries, they're looking for quality of life. They're looking for countries that have high quality, future focused skills. And all of that plays into having decent jobs, a well-educated population, thinking to the future in terms of what sort of skills we're going to focus on supplying and so on. And so I think that we really need to sort of get with the program in the way that the world has moved on there. And also where the futures element, I think, is quite interesting in that is that, our future generations and our younger generations do want entirely different things. They don't even want a work-life balance. They want a life-work balance. And if we're going to attract those sort of quality young people to come and work in different sectors, then we kind of need to recognise that. So that all plays into the wellbeing and happiness agenda as well. But in terms of the I suppose the downsides, as I said, so I don't think there are any downsides in terms of the mission or pitfalls in terms of the missions. The challenges are actually getting people to do it, and to do it when there are so many pulls of a system of old trying to stop them doing it. So, you know, one of our missions is to keep people well before they get ill, and not just rely on the sticking plaster, as brilliant as it is, our National Health Service, not just to rely on that to treat people when they're ill. Now, that's all very well and good, but you're trying to change a system which has already got huge amounts of demand in it to focus more on the system and the things that keep people well in the first place, which are all the things that are in the HPI here and are in our Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And that, against also a backdrop of the performance measures that we hold people to account on, the way in which we allocate budgets on a short-term basis, and the way in which politicians operate on a short-term basis from one election to the next. So all of that works against a shift. So I don't think there's any easy answer to it. I think it's like bit by bit. And, you know, we've got some brilliant examples in Wales of where one intervention, for example, that I made on stopping a motorway go ahead because we couldn't demonstrate how that was in line with our Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, has now led to a whole transformation of our whole approach to transport planning. Now, if we'd started with, we need to change the world on transport planning, it would have been too big and too difficult and so on. But you've got to start somewhere, and I think start building a movement around challenging and speaking out. And that's where I do think that one, having this is a legislative requirement rather than a nice to have is important, and two, having some sort of independent institution, whether that's a commissioner, a commission, or whatever you want to call it, who is going to call out when when decisions are being taken which is not in line with delivering this well-being and happiness approach.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sophie. There's a lot of really good stuff in there. So we are coming up on time, so I did want to really plug how to get involved with the Happy Planet Index moving forward. So I'm just going to pop up the chat really quickly. Sorry, the presentation. So give me 1 second. All right. So there's lots of ways to get involved. So basically, as Sama ran us through earlier, there's lots of data to explore on the Happy Planet Index website. So we'd say, please go on there, play around with the data, download our resources. There's an Excel file, really big, love me an Excel file. Look through the data and see some of the insights, especially for what's happening in your own country. Make sure to share the Happy Planet Index. So after this event, I'll be sending out links to get all the stuff that you need. And also, really importantly, we'd love for you to join the WEAll Global Network. So that's, again, a network of people all around the world, organizations and movements, and of course, people like our amazing panelists today who are working towards an economy that prioritizes people and planet in the long term. So do get involved, reach out, ask us any questions. We'd love to have you be part of our membership or just as a friend of the network. And so I guess I wanted to thank you all so much for joining this event. I've left really feeling very hopeful, and I love that our panelists really made it feel very practical. Of course, we've got this nice shiny index, but really there's so much that we need to think about to make this, shift our priorities and make that a reality. But I feel really hopeful that it's possible. We can create a world that we all want. And like our tagline for the Happy Planet Index says, we can live good lives that don't cost the earth. So I'm really looking forward to working with you all as WEAll and as friends moving forward. So thank you so much for joining. And thanks again to our wonderful panelists. I can't believe we got you to join, and I've learned a lot myself. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.